My name is Claire Harmon. I'm 29 years old. When I was 24, my father stood at his retirement party in front of 52 people, took the microphone from the event coordinator, and said, "I have one daughter worth bragging about, and she's standing right here." He pulled my sister into a hug. He didn't look at me once. The room applauded. My mother cried happy tears. And I sat at table 9, the last table, the one closest to the catering station, holding a glass of sparkling cider that had gone warm. And I understood something I'd been refusing to understand for my entire life. I was never going to matter to these people. I went home that night, packed 2 suitcases, and I didn't speak to any of them for 5 years. Then, last March, my mother called from a number I didn't recognize. She said 4 words before I could hang up. "Megan needs you, Claire." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. Because the woman who'd spent 24 years telling me I wasn't enough was now asking me to save the one person she'd always chosen over me. This is what happened. The Harmon family lived at 2214 Birchwood Drive in Dayton, Ohio. 3-bedroom colonial, beige siding, a garden my mother kept perfectly trimmed because appearances were the religion she practiced most faithfully. My father was an operations manager at a regional manufacturing company. My mother was a dental office administrator. They had 2 daughters. And from the day I was old enough to understand the difference, I understood what that meant in our house. My sister was born in 1991. I came along in 1995, 4 years apart. But we lived in completely different families. My sister was the one who got called down for praise. I was the one called down to be reminded of something I'd done wrong. She got the bigger room. I got the one next to the furnace that rattled every time the heat kicked on. She got a used car for her 16th birthday, a green Honda Civic that my parents spent 3 weeks researching and cleaning before they presented it to her with a ribbon on the steering wheel. I turned 16 and my mother said, "We'll see about a car when your grades reflect the effort you claim you're making." My grades were a 3.2. My sister's had been a 2.9 when she got hers. I kept that information in a notebook. I wrote down a lot of things, because I think even then I knew there would come a day when I'd need proof that I hadn't invented this. Dinner at our house was every night at 6:30. My father sat at the head. My sister sat at his right. I sat at the opposite end, next to my mother, which sounds fine, until you understand that my mother spent those dinners facing my father, angled away from me, so that the entire table's attention naturally flowed in one direction. My father asked my sister about her day with genuine curiosity. He asked about her friends, her classes, her opinions on things. Then he'd glance at me, usually when he needed something passed, and say things like, "Claire, what do you actually want to do after high school?" with a tone that implied the answer would disappoint him regardless of what it was. I was accepted to Ohio State in March of my senior year. Full application, no help. I did it alone at the library, because our home computer was in my sister's room, and she'd put a password on it junior year. I got in. I came home, set the acceptance letter on the kitchen counter next to the bowl of fruit my mother kept for appearances, and waited. My mother looked at it. She said, "That's a big school. Are you sure you're ready for that?" My father didn't comment at all. 3 weeks later, when my sister got into her graduate school program, my mother made her favorite dinner, bought her a new planner, and sat at the table. We raised a remarkable young woman. She was talking about my sister. I was sitting 4 feet away. I paid for college with loans, a Pell Grant, and 2 part-time jobs. My parents paid for my sister's master's degree in full. $62,000 over 2 years. I know the number because I found the bank statements once in the filing cabinet in my father's office when I was home for Thanksgiving sophomore year, looking for a stamp. I put them back. I didn't say anything. I wrote it in my notebook. College was where I started becoming someone I actually recognized. I studied communications. I made friends who didn't rank me. I had a professor, Dr. Weston, who read my first long essay and wrote in the margin, "This is the kind of clarity people spend years trying to develop. Keep writing." I cried in the campus bathroom afterward, not from sadness, but because it was the first time someone in an authority position had looked at something I created and said it was good without an asterisk attached. I came home less and less. Holidays were survivable in small doses. Christmas 2016. My mother spent 45 minutes at dinner describing every detail of my sister's new apartment in Columbus. The crown molding. The exposed brick. The proximity to a farmer's market. Then she looked at me across the table and said, "You're still in the dorms, right?" I was 21 years old, and she spoke to me the way someone speaks about a college freshman they've just met. I said yes. My father nodded once and refilled his wine. I graduated in May 2017. No one came. I hadn't invited them, and I want to be honest about why. It wasn't because I didn't want them there. It was because I'd spent 4 years rebuilding myself into something that felt real, and I didn't trust them not to dismantle it in an afternoon. I watched the ceremony from the audience first, helping a friend's family find their seats, and when I walked across that stage I heard my friend Maya scream my name from the third row. That was enough. It had to be. The retirement party was August of 2019. My father had worked at the same company for 31 years, and they threw him a send-off at the Marriott Ballroom off I-75. 52 people. I counted them out of habit. Long tables set with white linens, a slideshow of company photos, an open bar that my father's co-workers used with considerable enthusiasm. I drove 2.5 hours from Cincinnati, where I was working as a junior content writer at a marketing firm. I bought a new dress, $58 from Ann Taylor. I pressed it the night before. I arrived at 6:15. My mother greeted me at the door the way she might greet a neighbor she had a polite but not particularly warm relationship with. "Oh good, you made it." She was wearing a blue dress I'd never seen. Her hair was done. She looked beautiful. She looked past me almost immediately, to wave at someone across the room. I found my table. Table 9. The round one near the kitchen door. I sat across from 2 of my father's co-workers I'd never met, and a couple who spent most of the night talking only to each other. My sister arrived at 6:40 with her husband at the time, sitting at table 2, right next to the head table. My father saw her come in and his face changed, the way faces change when something genuinely delights them. He crossed the room in 12 steps and hugged her for a long time. He looked over her shoulder and saw me. He nodded. That was it. Just a nod, like I was someone he vaguely recognized from a work function years ago. The speeches started at 7:30. Colleagues stood up and talked about my father's dedication and his sense of humor, and the time he saved a quarterly deadline by staying until 3 in the morning. Then, his supervisor handed him the microphone for a final toast. My father stood up. He was wearing the tie my sister had given him for Christmas, the navy one with the small gold pattern. He thanked his company. He thanked his colleagues. He talked about the house on Birchwood Drive and what it meant to come home to his family. And then he said it. "I have one daughter worth bragging about, and she's standing right here." He put his arm around my sister, who had walked up to stand beside him. The room laughed warmly, the way people laugh when something is charming and familiar. My mother was already dabbing her eyes. 2 of my father's co-workers at the table nearby started clapping. My sister shook her head and said, "Dad, stop." But she was smiling the whole time. She didn't look at me. She knew where I was sitting. She didn't look. I sat very still. I have this thing I do when I'm overwhelmed, where I start counting objects in the room to give my mind something mechanical to hold on to. I counted ceiling tiles. 44. I counted the lights along the far wall. 16. I counted the number of people who were clapping. 31. My father finished his toast. My mother hugged him. People raised their glasses. I raised mine too because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. And then I set it back down and looked at the tablecloth and told myself to breathe slowly. After the toast, my sister found me during the dessert course. She put her hand on my shoulder and leaned down and said, "Hey, you okay?" I looked at her. "Did you hear what he said?" She straightened up. "You know how he is, Claire. He doesn't mean anything by it. He's just excited." I said, "He told 50 people I'm not worth bragging about." She looked uncomfortable. She looked toward the head table. She said, "Don't make this his night, okay? He worked for 31 years. Then she went back to table 2. That was the moment. Not the toast itself, but my sister's response to it. Not because it was uniquely cruel, but because it was so practiced, so smooth. The pivot away from my pain and back toward protecting the family's comfort had been rehearsed so many times over so many years that she did it without even thinking. And I realized she was never going to stop. Not because she was a bad person, but because she'd been trained, same as I'd been trained, just toward a different end. I went to find my parents after the dessert plates were cleared. My father was taking photos with his colleagues near the slideshow. I waited. When there was a gap, I stepped forward and said, "I'm going to head out." My father looked at me. "Already? It's barely 9. I said, "Yeah. Long drive." He said, "Okay, be safe," and turned back to his colleague. My mother was nearby. She said, "Text me when you get home." That was it. No acknowledgement of what had been said. No apology. Not even the awareness that something had occurred that might require one. I drove home to Cincinnati on I-75 South. 2 hours and 22 minutes. And I called my friend Denise from the road and told her everything. She listened. At the end she said, "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know yet. But I did know, actually. I'd known since I was sitting at table 9, counting ceiling tiles. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. 3 days after the party, I changed my phone number. I didn't send the new one to my parents or my sister. I updated my address with my employer and my bank, and no one in my family. I wasn't dramatic about it. I didn't send a letter explaining myself. I didn't post anything. I just became unavailable. My friend Denise had my new number. My college friend Maya had it. My co-workers had it. That was enough. I wasn't running from anything. I was simply stopping the process of showing up somewhere I wasn't wanted, and acting like the reason it hurt was my fault. The first holidays were strange. Thanksgiving, 2019, I made a full meal in my apartment by myself, and ate it watching a documentary about national parks. It sounds pathetic, but it wasn't, actually. It was the first Thanksgiving in my memory where no one looked past me while I was talking, where no one made a comment about my career choice, or my apartment, or my relationship status. I washed the dishes in my own kitchen and thought, this is what peace feels like. I hadn't recognized it before because I'd never been allowed to have enough of it to learn its shape. Christmas, I went to Denise's family in Columbus. Her mother fed me until I couldn't move, and her younger brother beat me at 3 consecutive rounds of a card game, and no one at any point asked me why I wasn't with my own family, or made me feel like an intruder for being there. I cried in the guest bathroom before bed. Quietly. Just a few minutes. Not from sadness. From gratitude. Mostly. And maybe from grief. Because there's something in having what you needed all along that makes you feel the absence of it all the more sharply. I built a life. That's the only way I know how to describe it. Not that I lived one, but that I actively constructed one from materials I gathered myself. I got promoted to senior content strategist in January 2020. I moved to a better apartment in the Hyde Park neighborhood of Cincinnati. 900 square feet, 2nd floor, windows that faced east so the mornings were bright. I started therapy with a woman named Dr. Pierce, who had an office above a coffee shop on Erie Avenue, and who asked me in our 3rd session, "When was the last time someone in your family made you feel seen?" I thought about it for a long time. I said I couldn't remember. She wrote something down. She said, "Let's start there." I dated someone for 8 months in 2021. His name was Owen. He was kind, genuinely kind, the type of person who remembered small things you mentioned and asked about them later. He said once, after I'd deflected a compliment for the 3rd time in one conversation, "Why do you always do that? Why do you make yourself smaller when someone tries to see you?" I didn't have a clean answer. He wasn't wrong, and we ended things eventually. Not because of that, but because I was still more committed to the work of healing than I was to the risk of being known by someone new, and he deserved someone who could show up more fully than I was capable of at the time. We ended well. We still exchange messages around the holidays. 2022, I got my own client accounts, and a 15% raise. I started a running habit, something I'd never done before, and I ran my first 5K in October, and finished in under 32 minutes. I have the finisher medal on my bathroom mirror. I look at it every morning. My friends group shifted and settled into something real. Denise, Maya, A woman from my running club named Patricia, who brought homemade tamales to every gathering, and who once drove 40 minutes on a Thursday night, just because I'd texted that I was having a hard week. I was learning what family actually meant. And it had almost nothing to do with biology. My aunt, my mother's younger sister, found me in the fall of 2022. She sent a message to my work email, which she'd found on my company's website. She said she wasn't reaching out on behalf of my parents. She said she'd been thinking about me since the retirement party, and she was sorry she hadn't said something then. She said she'd watched what happened my whole childhood, and she was ashamed of herself for never speaking up. She didn't ask me to reconcile with anyone. She just wanted me to know that she had seen it, and that it was real, and that I hadn't been wrong. I read that message 6 times. I wrote back 2 days later. We started having phone calls every few weeks. She became one of the steadiest things in my life. My aunt was the one who called me the second time, in early March of last year. She said she wanted me to hear it from someone who loved me before I heard it from anyone else. She told me that my sister's marriage had ended 8 months prior, that my sister had lost her job at the consulting firm where she'd worked for 6 years, that she'd been struggling, really struggling, and that my parents had been managing the situation the way they managed everything, by controlling the narrative, keeping it quiet, making sure no one outside the immediate circle knew anything was wrong. She told me my mother had been telling extended family for years that I'd cut off the whole family without explanation, that I was going through something, that it was a phase and they were giving me space. She'd been framing my absence as instability on my part, not as a consequence of anything they'd done. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up. My mother called the following week. New number. But my aunt had warned me it was coming. I answered. My mother sounded older, more worn down, some of the certainty gone from her voice in a way that made me feel complicated things. She said she knew I probably didn't want to hear from her. She said she was calling because my sister needed help, and wasn't accepting it from them. She said, I know things haven't been right between us. I know that. It was the closest she'd ever come to an acknowledgement, and it still had no apology in it. I said I needed a few days to think. She said okay. That was the whole call. I called Dr. Pierce that afternoon. I told her everything. She asked me, what would it mean to you to go? I said it would mean I was strong enough not to need it to mean anything else. That I could walk into that situation and hold myself without requiring them to finally see me before I could be okay. She asked me if I believed that was true. I said I thought I was close enough to find out. I texted my mother 7 days later. I told her I would come. I told her it wasn't for her, or for my father. I told her I had conditions, and I listed them in writing because I'd learned that spoken agreements in that family had a way of being revised later. I would not stay overnight. I would speak to my sister alone first. I would not perform happiness, or pretend the last 5 years hadn't happened. I would not accept blame for my absence being framed as something I did to them. I pressed send. She replied within 4 minutes. Thank you. Just come. Please. I drove from Cincinnati to Dayton on a Saturday afternoon. 54 miles. Exactly 1 hour on I-75 North. I'd driven that road hundreds of times in my life, and it never felt neutral. Past the exit for the mall where my mother used to take my sister for back-to-school shopping while I stayed home with my father, who spent those afternoons watching golf and answering my questions in monosyllables. Past the water tower I'd stared at on every drive home from college, calculating how many more hours I had to be in that house before I could leave again. The house on Birchwood Drive looked exactly the same. My mother's garden was still maintained with that same rigid neatness. My father's truck was in the driveway. There was a second car I didn't recognize, older. One of the rear bumper panels slightly dented, parked on the street in front. I sat in my car for 4 minutes. I watched the front window. I texted my aunt. I'm here. She sent back a single word. Proud. My mother opened the door before I reached it. She looked at me with something in her face I hadn't seen before. Something closer to relief than I'd expected, and something else underneath it that I recognized as guilt being worn just on the surface, not deep enough yet to be real. I didn't hug her. She reached briefly toward me and I stepped to the side, not dramatically, just to make clear. She nodded. She understood. Or she pretended to. My father was in the living room. He stood when I came in. He looked the same, maybe slightly older, more gray at the temples. He said, "Claire." Just my name. I said, "Hi." He sat back down. My mother offered me water, coffee, tea. I said no. I said, "Tell me what's happening with my sister first." All of it. They told me. My sister had been with the consulting firm since 2017, the same year I graduated. She'd made manager by 2020, married her husband in 2019. I hadn't been invited to the wedding. Or rather, I'd been invited in the way that makes it clear the invitation is a formality, and not an expectation. She and her husband had bought a house in Columbus in 2021. By 2022, the marriage was falling apart. He left in October of that year. My parents knew within weeks but had told no one, not even their own siblings, because what would people think? My sister lost the job the following spring. Performance issues, her manager told her. Too many missed deadlines, too many days absent without explanation. My parents had been paying her mortgage for 7 months. They'd set her up in the spare room 2 months ago, quietly, telling neighbors she was in between apartments. She barely left the room. She'd stopped seeing friends. She'd stopped answering her phone. I asked the question I already knew I needed to ask. Did she try to reach me? My mother looked at my father. My father looked at the floor. I said it again, slower. Did my sister try to reach me at any point while this was happening? My mother said, "She mentioned you a few times." My father said, "We didn't think it would help." I said, "That wasn't your decision to make." He said, "You changed your number, Claire. You walked out of this family." I felt my jaw tighten. I said, "I removed myself from a situation where I was consistently treated as less than nothing. That is not the same thing as walking out." He started to respond and I held up my hand. I said, "I'll talk to you both after I see her." "Where is she?" "Upstairs. End of the hall. The room that used to be my room," which I noted with a flatness I was proud of not reacting to. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again and said her name. There was a long pause and then a voice, muffled and rough. "What?" I said it was me. Another pause, longer this time. Then I heard her moving, and the door opened. She looked like someone I recognized from a photograph of a person I used to know. She was thinner, significantly, her collarbone visible above the neckline of an oversized sweatshirt, her hair pulled back unevenly, dark circles deep under her eyes. She was 33 years old and she looked worn in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with a very specific kind of exhaustion. She looked at me for a long time without saying anything. I said, "Hey," she said. "I didn't know you were coming." I said, "I know. Can I come in?" She stepped back. The room was dim, curtains drawn, a lamp on the nightstand throwing a small circle of yellow light. There were clothes on the floor, not dirty necessarily, just unmoved, like she'd taken them off and left them where they landed, and hadn't had the energy to do anything else with them. A stack of books on the desk with a coffee mug on top, that had clearly been there long enough for a ring to form underneath it. The window unit hummed at a low setting, even though it wasn't that warm outside. The room smelled like sleep and something sweeter underneath, like she'd been burning a candle weeks ago and the scent had saturated the fabric. I sat on the floor. She looked at me like I was doing something strange. Then she sat on the floor too, her back against the side of the bed, and we sat there for a while without talking. Outside, I could hear the faint sound of the television my parents had turned on downstairs, the way people fill silence with noise when they're uncomfortable. She said, "This is embarrassing." I said, "For who?" She let out a breath that was almost a laugh but not quite. She pulled her knees up to her chest. She said, "I had everything. Claire, I had the job and the house and the husband and the life they wanted for me, and I still managed to destroy it." I said, "That's not what happened." She said, "That's exactly what happened." I said, "Then walk me through it." She did. She talked for a long time. About the marriage. About how it had been cracking for years before it broke. About how she'd been so focused on performing the life that was expected of her, that she'd never stopped to ask whether it was the life she actually wanted. About the job. about the pressure she'd carried since she was old enough to understand what was expected of the daughter in our family, who had been designated as the one worth something. She said, "Do you have any idea what it's like to be the one they chose? You think it's a gift, but it's not. It's a job. You spend your whole life waiting to get fired." I said, "I know." She looked at me. I said, "I know because I spent my whole life watching you work that job, and knowing I'd never be hired for it no matter what I did." She started crying, quietly at first, then more fully. She didn't cover her face. She just let it happen. I didn't reach for her. I let her have it. After a while she said, "I tried to call you 2 years ago. Your number wasn't working." I told her I'd changed it. She said, "They didn't give me the new one." I said I knew. I told her I had found out only recently. She went very still. I explained what my aunt had told me, that at some point after I'd made myself unreachable, our parents had apparently stopped correcting anyone who assumed I was the reason for the distance. That they'd let the family believe the story was about me, about my choices, when really they'd never tried to bridge the gap at all. When my sister had asked about contacting me, they'd discouraged it. They hadn't wanted her reaching toward me because they'd never stopped seeing me as the thing that wasn't valuable. And valuable things shouldn't need the thing that isn't. My sister's face went through several things very quickly. She said, "I want to hear what they say about that." I said, "So do I." We went downstairs together. My sister stood in the doorway to the living room. My parents looked up with the expression of people who have been rehearsing their reactions and aren't entirely sure which one to deploy. I put down the glass of water my mother had eventually left on the coffee table for me, and I said, "My sister says she tried to contact me 2 years ago and couldn't, and that when she asked about reaching me, you discouraged her." "I want to understand that," my father said. "We thought it would upset her." I said, "You thought it would upset her to reach out to her sister?" He said, "You were gone, Claire. You disappeared. We didn't know what to say to her about it." I said, "You could have said, Claire changed her number when she decided to step back from the family, and here is how you might try to reach her anyway." "That is what you could have said." My mother started to speak. I said, "And at the same time, you were telling our aunts and cousins and everyone else that I was going through something, that I'd cut everyone off without reason, that you were giving me space." My mother said, "We were trying to protect the family." I said, "You were protecting the story. There's a difference." My father stood up. He does that when he feels cornered. He stands up and crosses his arms. And it used to make me physically smaller when I was a child. This reflex he had of making himself larger when challenged. I stayed exactly where I was. I said, "Sit down. I'm not done." He sat. I said, 5 years ago at your retirement party you stood up with a microphone and told 50 people that you had one daughter worth bragging about. You didn't acknowledge me. You didn't look at me when you said it. You just said it. And the room laughed. And you loved it." My mother said, "That was a joke." I said, "Stop saying things were jokes. You said it in front of my face and you meant it. You have always meant it." The only difference between that night and every other night was that there was a microphone. My father's jaw tightened. He said, "You've always been dramatic." I said, "I've always been accurate. And you've always called it dramatic because it was easier than hearing it." My sister made a sound from the doorway. My parents looked at her. She said, "She's right." My father turned toward her. She said, "You have always treated her differently, and you've never admitted it once. Not once. And I let it happen because I was afraid of what would happen if I said something." My mother started crying. Real tears, I think. The kind that come when something true has finally found its way to the surface after too long underground. My father sat down again. He looked at his hands. For a moment he looked like someone I might have been able to reach. If things had been different. If I'd had 30 years in a different version of this family. But I didn't. And I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I said, "Here's what I need to say, and then I'll tell you what happens next. I don't need anything from you. I haven't needed anything from you in years. I've built a life you don't know anything about, and it's a good one. And I did that without either of you. And I don't say that to hurt you. I say it because I need you to understand that when I leave here today, I will not be leaving with a hole in me. I already filled that hole. I want you to know that your second daughter is not useless. Your second daughter is the only reason your first daughter is going to get help. And I want you to sit with that." My mother put her face in her hands. My father was very still. My sister was crying in the doorway. I picked up my bag. I found a residential treatment program, not because my parents asked me to, but because my sister asked me herself, a few days after that visit, when she called my aunt, and my aunt gave her my number. She called me on a Wednesday night and she said, "I don't know how to start. I don't know where to look." I said I'd help. I spent 4 evenings researching. I looked at 6 programs within 2 hours of Dayton, cross-referenced reviews, accreditation, approach to co-occurring depression and anxiety. I found one in Yellow Springs, a 40-minute drive, 30-day residential with an optional extended outpatient follow-up. I called and spoke with an intake counselor named James, who answered every question I had without rushing me. I called my sister back and walked her through everything. My parents paid. I was clear that this was not a discussion. I'd send them the details, and they would pay, and they would let my sister make every decision from that point forward about their involvement in her recovery. My father resisted for about 40 seconds before my sister, who was in the room with them when I called, said, "Pay it, Dad." He did. I drove my sister to the intake appointment. It was a Tuesday morning, overcast, the kind of March weather that can't decide whether it's still winter. We drove mostly in silence. Somewhere on Route 68 she asked, "Do you forgive me for not standing up for you back then?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "I don't know yet. But I'm here. That means something." She nodded. She looked out the window. After a minute she said, "That's more than I deserve." I said, "Maybe. But you're my sister. And you're a person who got broken by the same people who broke me. And I'd rather find out who you are when you're not performing for them than never know at all." She went in. I watched her walk through the front doors. She turned back once and raised her hand. I raised mine. Then she was gone. The drive home was 53 minutes. I called my aunt from the car. She asked how it went. I said, "I think okay. I think something shifted." She said, "I know it did. I could hear it in your voice." I didn't respond for a few seconds. Then I said, "Why didn't you say something earlier? When we were kids? When you could see what was happening?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Because I was afraid of your mother. Of losing the relationship. And I'm ashamed of that. I'm still ashamed of it." I said, "I know. I'm not saying it to blame you. I just want you to know that it mattered. The silence mattered, not just theirs." She said, "I know." We stayed on the phone without talking for a little while, which is something only people who really trust each other can do. My sister finished the program in April. I visited twice during the 30 days. We sat in a garden in the back of the facility and talked about things we'd never talked about, not the big family things, but smaller ones. What she actually wanted to be when she was 9. "A marine biologist," she said, which made me laugh because it was so completely unexpected. "What I'd wanted," I said, "a novelist." She said, "Why didn't you?" I said, "I didn't think I was allowed to want things that weren't practical, and I also didn't think anyone would read them." She said, "I would read them." It was such a small thing to say, and it landed somewhere I hadn't expected. She moved into her own apartment in May, smaller than before but hers. She started seeing a therapist. She started walking every morning. Long walks through her neighborhood, listening to audiobooks, building back the scaffolding of a daily life. We text most days now. Sometimes it's just a picture of something she saw on a walk, a dog, an unusually large mushroom, a mural she passed that reminded her of something we talked about. I text back. It's slow, and it's careful, and it's real. My parents sent me a card in June, my mother's handwriting. It said, "We know we have a lot to make up for. We understand if this is all you can give right now. We're grateful." It wasn't an apology exactly. It was the closest they'd come. I put it in my desk drawer. I haven't responded. I haven't decided what I want that to look like yet, or whether I want anything at all. My therapist says there's no deadline. I'm trying to believe that. What I know is this. I drove to Dayton and back, and I didn't lose myself. I sat in the house where I learned to make myself invisible, and I took up space and I said true things clearly, and I didn't ask permission, and I didn't collapse. I helped my sister not because I owed her, not because my parents deserved the rescue, not because forgiveness required it. I helped her because she was a person in pain, who needed someone to show up, and I finally had enough to give. That is what 5 years of building something real looks like when it gets tested. It holds. My name is Claire Harmon. I am 29 years old. I am a senior content strategist, a runner, a person who knows how to cook a real meal and sit with silence and let other people be wrong without needing them to take it back before I can breathe. I am my aunt's niece and Denise's best friend and the person Patricia calls when she needs someone honest. I am slowly, carefully, becoming my sister's sister, again, a different kind, better than the one we never really got to be. I am not the dramatic one. I am not the difficult one. I am not what was said into a microphone at a retirement party in 2019. I never was. And if you've been sitting somewhere in your own life at a table 9, holding something warm that was supposed to be a celebration, counting the ceiling tiles just to keep from falling apart, I want you to know that the ceiling tiles are not your life. The table is not your worth. And the people who assigned you your seat don't get to be the last word on who you are. They just don't.